He came up to me and he says, "Here's what I want. I want something that comes out of nowhere and gets really, really big." I said, "Yeah, I think I know how to do that." So I got to work on it, and 4 days later, the opticals were in, that is, the animation was in, and I went into the sound mixing theater at Skywalker Sound and dropped in the logo theme. Now, of course, when I got there, and I hit play, he had given me a bunch of timings, right? That the big THX logo will appear at this time, and the whole thing is this. All the timings were off. So, not to worry, since the score for it was a computer program, I went and changed a couple of numbers and ran off another one and synchronized it, and it worked.
You're listening to Music Dialogue, conversations with leading composers and music professionals in the film and television industry. Hi, I'm Nick Johnson. On today's show, I'm speaking with James Moorer. James is a pioneer in digital audio and computer music. In addition to winning an Emmy and an award from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences for his contributions to digital signal processing, he also created one of the most recognizable audio logos of all time, the THX Deep Note.
I've always been into audio. In high school, I used to make, this was in the vacuum tube era, I used to make hi-fi amplifiers and preamplifiers and fiddle around with microphones. I had limited means, so it was pretty threadbare. I'd use old junked radios for parts, take them apart and put them together in other ways. In college, I took the straight engineering curriculum. I went to MIT and majored in engineering. And then when I graduated MIT, I didn't quite know what I wanted to do, so I stuck around there and took another degree in applied mathematics, which has actually served me quite well subsequently. After that, I came to Stanford. I worked as a professional programmer in the computer science department for 3 years, and then finally got into graduate school there in Stanford. The nice thing about Stanford is that after you pass the doctoral qualifiers, you have a great deal of freedom. So I dug into it, and within the first 2 years, I passed the doctoral qualifiers. The nice thing about Stanford and the artificial intelligence lab in particular is that a number of disciplines had come together around this computer. For instance, we had people from organic chemistry, we had people from linguistics, psychology, ornithology, and we also had a music group there, the computer music group headed by John Chowning. I worked with another graduate student there, John Gray, and we sort of did our doctoral dissertations in parallel. Mine was on transcription of musical sound by computer, that is, writing a score, playing a piece into it and writing a score. This was in 1975, and John Gray did his dissertation on perception of sound, specifically perception of timbre or tone color. And we worked together quite a bit. He used my analytic tools to give numerical representations of the sounds he was working with and to modify them and resynthesize them. So that was my entry into digital sound or digital audio. When both of us graduated, we founded an institute at Stanford, the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics, that is still there today and is going strong. And it's huge now. It's probably a half dozen faculty and hundreds of students. I've been quite proud of that. And they have a full curriculum there. There's several things we did that were a little bit different. That is, we taught audio and audio signal processing, that is the technical side of it, to music majors. But the other thing is that we also taught perception, how people hear. A lot of times you can go through a music school entirely and not have a clue about how people actually hear or how people make speech or understand speech. So we made sure to include that as a standard part of the curriculum at Stanford. So I was quite happy in the innovations we did there.
How did you get hired at Lucasfilm?
Well, I don't quite know, of course, but I got a call from Ed Catmull, he and Alvy Ray Smith had been contracted by Lucasfilm to set up the computer division of Lucasfilm. And they had come on, I guess, a year earlier. I came on in 1980. Initially, there were, just a dozen of us in a little room in San Anselmo over some property that George owned over a bank. So we called it the bank building. From there, the computer division grew to over 70 people, I think around 75 or so. And it was in 4 divisions: computer games, which eventually led to LucasArts, computer editing, which led to EditDroid, I guess we called it, the idea of which EditDroid never got commercialized, but I believe the idea was picked up by the fellows that started Avid Systems and the Media Composer, gave birth to the whole idea of nonlinear and digital editing. Of course, computer graphics, which was spun off later as Pixar, and then my group, which was digital audio, that started a company called Sonic Solutions, that we offered the first large-scale digital audio editors. I can personally take responsibility for knocking tape editing out of Europe and probably out of the US as well. We also had several things, like we set up authoring systems for the first CD-ROM recorders, or the first CD recording devices. The original device was made by Sony itself, but they didn't want to program it, so they basically allowed us to sell these things at pass-through so that we could sell the software for it. And we had, I think, probably 200 of them out before they started getting popular. Eventually, after several years, the recording devices came out as plugins for computers. And that's when it really took off. But before then, there were these large clunky devices. So we had a number of firsts at Sonic Solutions.
What were you working on at Lucasfilm right before you created the Deep Note?
Well, I was working on computer aids for film sound, and I had done a number of things. For instance, we were working on large-scale hardware. In those days, we didn't have computers of anything like the power we have today. The power sitting on my desktop here is phenomenal. So we had to build large special purpose devices. So I had a device that I and a couple of other fellows had built that it was a full 19-inch rack that is 19 inches wide and 6 feet tall of hardware that would do digital audio in real time, that was the real goal. One of the things I found going into the film industry is everything had to be hands-on right now. They weren't like us Stanford academics that could sit back and take an hour to compute 10 minutes of music and then play it. They had to have it right that instant. Well, that was something you couldn't do in 1980 when I went to work for them. So I built this large audio signal processing system, and we had programmed it. And I had done a number of demonstration processes for it. For instance, there were a couple of problems Ben Burt had. One was in spatialization. So I had actually set up the signal processor to be an elaborate panner for him. The difference between that and a regular panner is that it had Doppler shift going by, and it could pan in surround, whereas the best you could get commercially was a stereo panner then. And that was used in several of the movies. Other things like, for instance, he needed sounds to be extended. One of the things they do is when they need sounds for a certain movie, like Raiders of the Lost Ark, Temple of Doom, he had a scene where they're shooting these arrows across the gorge there. So he goes into a quiet room and has an archer shoot an arrow across, and he sets up his recorder and records it. Well, it's fine, except it's about 1/10 of a second long. Zoom, it's done. Well, nothing's that short in the movies. He wants it to go and go across the canyon. So I took the same sound and digitally analyzed it and produced him 10 minutes of it, so he could then take as much or as little of it as he wanted to, put it in the panner, pan it across the screen, make the pitch go down. That's the Doppler shift as it flies off, and he had great fun. All the arrow sounds in Temple of Doom were done using that system. There was another part where he wanted the sound of an airplane crashing. There's a certain sound that I guess airplanes make when they're, diving straight into the ground. And he had some old 78 recordings of the real thing. That is, in a blitz in Nazi Germany. Some wise guy at the local radio station stuck a microphone out the window and recorded these things. But they were of very, very low quality, and there were only short segments of it that were decent. And I did the same thing again and gave him, 10 minutes of airplane crashing. That was also used in Temple of Doom. So I was doing a number of projects, and we were making plans to make more of the big audio processors as well, although we never quite got there. I had also pioneered some work in noise reduction. We actually had a job from outside the studio. The fellows from Zoetrope who were doing Amadeus, the film Amadeus, they came in with a particular problem. That is, the asylum scene with F. Murray Abraham was recorded on a analog tape recorder that was miscalibrated. They had calibrated it, but the calibration was off, so it was recorded at a very low level and turned out to be very, very hissy. So we developed some techniques to help reduce the hiss of it. And in fact, if you go back to the Asylum scene, I thought it turned out pretty well. Sounds pretty crisp these days. But that was one of the first commercial uses of noise reduction techniques. This is at Sonic Solutions later. This is what we specialized in. And in CD re-release, that is, at Sonic, we hit the big remastering wave when the CD had come out and all the big labels were digging into their vaults and pulling out all their old master tapes and finding out that they had gotten a little bit hissy or that they weren't up to CD standards. So I made a calculation one time that by the time it became a commodity, Sonic systems had been used to remaster something like 80,000 different CDs. Now, most of these you've never heard of, right? These would be like old blues recordings. And in Europe, there were thousands and thousands of pre-war classical recordings some of them came with these unbelievable stories, just heartrending stories about the master recordings being buried in the backyard of some Dutch engineer's house to keep them out of the war. Subsequently, they wanted to restore them and start bringing them out. These were by famous pre-war European conductors. So we helped in quite a bit of that as well.
Tell me the story behind creating the THX Deep Note trademark.
Yeah, well, it worked like this. Tom Holman, the head audio engineer at Lucasfilm at that time, they went to set up the theater for the release of, actually this was at Empire Strikes Back. They went to a prominent theater in San Francisco for the debut, and they decided they wanted to check out the sound system. So they went behind the screen to look at there should be three big, JBL or Jensen cavernous speakers behind the screen. And they found one of them was there and hooked up. One of them was there and hooked up, but it was turned around backwards. And a third one was disconnected and had fallen over. It was on the ground. Well, they were completely horrified by that. And they scrambled around and they sort of got the whole thing to work in time for the release, but Tom Holman was so disgusted by it, he said, look, this is crazy. We've got to come up with a way to have a standard for theater film sound. So he and one other engineer, Scott Robinson, worked and put together what became the THX sound system, which was later spun off into a separate company, THX Limited. The sound system was working so well, George put it in his own mixing theaters, that when it came time for Return of the Jedi to come out, George used a technique he'd used before. I don't know if you know this, but at the time the original Star Wars came out, George essentially coerced the 160 or so 70 millimeter theaters into getting Dolby Surround by saying, well, if you don't get that surround system, we aren't going to send you the print of Star Wars. So indeed, he got them all to install the Dolby Surround system. Well, in 1983, he did the same thing with the THX sound system. He said, look, you folks have to invest in this THX sound system, replace your speakers and your amplifiers and stuff with the THX approved setup. And by then, it was something like 250 70 millimeter theaters, but they did it. So that they wanted something to come on before the feature so that people would know that something's different about the sound. The same thing happened at the original Star Wars as well. So George Lucas has a tradition, if you will, inside Lucasfilm of promoting from within or giving people within the company projects to, help them move up the ladder, get them out of their comfort zone, or give them opportunities to do something different. And there's a fellow who was assigned to it. I won't mention his name here, but he was given the task, and he went off. He had great ideas for this animation for it, the original animation. You should go back to the THX website and look at the original animation. I thought it was quite beautiful. It was stark and simple and to the point, and said what needed to be said without any frills. And now, I don't know this for sure, but I think what happened is that he spent all the money on the animation, and he didn't have any money left for the sound for it, for the music for it. So he looked around the company, and he found a staff person that he knew had musical background. He came up to me and he says, here's what I want. I want something that comes out of nowhere and gets really, really big. And I said, yeah, I think I know how to do that. So I got to work on it, and 4 days later, the opticals were in, that is, the animation was in, and I went into the sound mixing theater at Skywalker Sound, and dropped in the logo theme. Now, of course, when I got there, and I hit play, he had given me a bunch of timings, right? That the big THX logo will appear at this time, and the whole thing is this long. All the timings were off. So, not to worry, since the score for it was a computer program, I went and changed a couple of numbers and ran off another one and synchronized it, and it worked. Second time it worked perfectly. So we were in and out of the mixing theater in 10 minutes, and they had the THX logo theme.
Did you know what it was going to sound like when you wrote the code?
Oh, as soon as he said it, I knew exactly what I wanted to do and what it was going to sound like. Sure, I've been in music long enough to be able to visualize isn't the right word, audibilize these things.
Yeah.
So I knew exactly what it was going to sound like. That having been said, mind you, I got the whole thing working. It took about 2.5 days to get it to generate the sound, but then I spent a whole day tuning it, tweaking this and tweaking that, making sure the big sweep was smooth, and I had some cases where it was jerky, and making sure that the big chord, like the first time I did it, I didn't have any detuning on the big chord, so all the voices, all the oscillators went to exactly the correct pitches, and it fused into it sounded like a computer chord. It sounded like it was coming out of a computer. And so I went through and I detuned it. I had a book about piano tuning and read in it that they detuned that, how pianos have 2 and 3 strings for each note, and they detune them slightly. They don't. And I read a book which told about how much they detune it by, and I went and detuned all the oscillators by random numbers of that kind of magnitude, and that brightened it up quite a bit and made it sound more orchestral or organ-like or whatever.
Throughout your career, you've had many really great accomplishments. You've had some technical awards, an Emmy, and an award from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and you've created this piece of audio that is such an iconic sound and a huge part of pop culture. What does that success mean to you?
Oh, well, what do you mean? I'm terribly proud, and every time the THX people come back to me and allow me an opportunity to renew my personal brand and get on another podcast, I'm more than happy to do so. Mostly, I'm happy that we had an intellectual environment or an environment at Lucasfilm that allowed me to do these great things. George Lucas believed in promoting from within or engaging people from within and challenging them to go beyond what they've done before, and gave me a forum to put together what is a very unusual, I've come to realize now, is a very unusual piece of sound. Having come through Stanford and the modern music tradition, I didn't think it was anything special at the time, except for the fact that I thought that big chord at the end was going to just blow everybody away, which it did. But the whole lead up to it, that beginning cluster and stuff, it didn't occur to me that that's technically that's modern music. I mean, that's the kind of thing that your garage bands don't do. It's very that whole beginning section of it was very much in fact, I would say the whole piece is very much a Stanford sound. It sounds a lot like other things that we did in that time period. That's probably how I knew how to do it and what to do, is because we had made a bunch of interesting sounds during that period, that some of which sounded a lot like that.
What does an average day look like for you today?
Oh, well, it varies considerably. Right now, our granddaughter is visiting, and there's nothing that makes you feel young like a 2-year-old. That's certainly a pleasure. But the nice thing is at this point in my life, I get to choose what I want to do. I'm doing some research. I'm doing some performing. I'm doing a small amount of composing, not a lot. My wife and I have been doing some traveling too. All in all, it's a marvelous position. And the other nice thing about it is that in my position, if I have questions about something, I can generally send an email to any of the experts in the field and get a coherent answer. I try to keep up with the theoretical side of the industry, writing papers, giving papers, reading the technical journals. I mean, the delightful thing about it is that the whole, this is going to be a little tricky to explain, but let me say it and then I'll go backwards. the whole idea of applying intensive mathematical and engineering analysis to audio has just exploded now, and it's marvelous to see. And the reason I say that is because when I first got into this business in 68 or 70, digital audio wasn't a thing. And when I went to the engineering professors around Stanford and talked about digital audio and being able to do higher order filtering entirely in the computer, they would look at me and sort of dreamily talk about their 10th grade piano teacher or about how much fun they had playing in band or something like that. That is, I couldn't get the idea across that it was important to apply engineering to audio. And it really wasn't until the CD came out that they got the message. That is, the CD, the release of the CD, was the fastest technological turnover on record, where within 4 years, all the major vinyl pressing plants in this country were closed. The speed at which CDs took over audio was just astonishing, just absolutely astonishing. When DVDs came out, it didn't happen quite as rapidly. It didn't displace VHS tape for quite a while. Eventually it did. Eventually Blockbuster did close and the DVD took off. And of course, about the time that DVD Blu-ray comes in, streaming has now taken over, as it should, as we knew it would all along.
What advice would you give to anyone who wants to advance a career in film or television, focusing in music or audio?
Gosh, I have no clue. I mean, I sort of got into it by accident. The line I usually give is learn as much as you possibly can about it, and then do it. Do it as much as you can, any way that you can, and don't be ashamed to accept the dinkiest little position if it gives you experience. It's a long process and with plenty of dues to pay. Now, having said that, at least in the film industry, there is the following accepted way of getting into the film industry, which is you go to the USC Film School in Los Angeles. That's the feeder for the professional film sound industry. The people that go out of there, they, as part of their education there, they intern at various film studios, and you pretty much have a job waiting for you. Now, mind you, you go through the apprenticeship stage. There's probably, after school, there's probably 3 to 5 years of apprenticeship where you're pushing reels of, you're pushing sound around, or you're rolling stuff off onto hard drives or whatever. That's the established way of getting into it. If you show promise and you do well, you will get more and more projects thrown at you. Get in on the bottom, doing whatever is necessary, and learn the industry and learn what the needs of the industry are. One of the biggest things I find is that people coming in, well, especially if they don't have some musical training or something, they don't know how to hear. There's a kind of a critical listening that's involved in being an audio professional that has to be developed. It doesn't seem to just grow on the vine. And it involves listening into a sound, listening to every single bit of it.
So I've just got one more question for you, and this one's a bit unrelated. So is it Yanni or is it Laurel? And what do you think is behind it?
Okay, well, try the following experiment, okay? Play it on different media. Play it on your phone, with this on the speaker on your phone. Then play it on a hi-fi system. Then play it on a set of computer speakers. Then play it in your car. I could get it to flip from Laurel to Yanni depending on what I played it on. Playing it on my phone speaker, it was always Yanni. On the big hi-fi studio monitor speakers, it was always Laurel. And different other speakers are somewhere in between. It has to do with how we hear speech, how it's presented to us, what frequencies are missing and what frequencies are accented. And then there's believe me, there is some suggestibility involved in it too. Once you get an interpretation in your head, it's hard to get it out. But if you actually do critical listening to it, you'll find that your perception of it will flip back and forth depending on how it's played, where you hear it.
thank you very much for speaking with me today. It was so great to hear all these stories. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
That was a conversation with James Moorer, who created the iconic THX Deep Note audio trademark. You can find out more about James at his website at jamminpower.com. All of the music used in this episode was composed by William Ryan Fritsch, and you can find out more about him at williamryanfritsch.com. Please subscribe if you liked what you heard. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.